All right, so let's now take a look at some bad code that doesn't follow any of the principles or guidelines that I showed you in the previous lecture and actually start fixing it in this video. And the code that we're going to fix is also here in your starter files, and it is called clean.js. All right. Now let's open up our console back here because it is still running parcel from before. And so let's stop that now. So with Control C, and then let's also come to our index.html file. And then here, let's copy this because now we no longer want to include script.js. So I will comment it out, but instead we want clean.js that we will work on now. So give it a save. And now we will also run this code again with live server and no longer with parcel, because now there's nothing to bundle. All we want to do is to take a look at our code in a very simple way. So live server, and let me grab that tab from another browser that I have opened. And here we go. So you see indeed that the URL is different here because the default URL of live server is 8080. So as you see here, and of parcel, it is on port 1234. So it's different. So we are not interested in this one anymore, but instead in 8080. So we can close this one as well, and our sidebar too. So let's reload this here so we can see our results. Make it a bit bigger as well. And okay, let's start by analyzing here our clean code, or actually the not so clean code that we want to start fixing in this lecture. So this code is basically about a very, very simple budget application, let's say. And so here we have an object which is called budget, which contains a couple of objects. So each of them is basically an entry in the budget. So each one has a value, a description, and a user of the person who created the entry. So this one is Jonas, this one as well. And you see that here we have a negative value, which is basically an expense. So for groceries, for example, and here the positive one is for an income, like selling an old TV or monthly salary or freelancing. So we have Jonas, and then the other user that we have here is Matilda. Then down here we have a very simple object, which is basically spending limits. So Jonas can only spend 1,500 euros or dollars or whatever it is, and Matilda can only spend 100. Then we have a function to add a new entry to the budget, or actually this one is only for expenses. And so here we start seeing one of the bad practices, which is that this function name is not good at all. So it's not really descriptive of what's happening here. And so let's actually start by fixing that right away. So this one should be called add expense. So you see I'm changing it here, and I selected all of them by hitting Command D. So add next occurrence, right? So that's the first fix, but of course there are going to be some more. But let's keep going through our code here very quickly. And so next up, we have a check function, which will basically check the budget and see if any of the expenses are actually above the limit that we defined here. And if a certain expense is, then it will flag that by adding a limit string to a new flag property on the budget entry. All right. So this add expense here actually checks if the new expense is below the limit. So that happens right here. But there might already be an expense that is below the limit, or actually over the limit, which is like this one here. So 1,800, if we don't consider the minus. So I spent 1,800 here, and that of course is more than 1,500. And so this one would be marked as a limit. Okay, but again, we will see this in detail once we fix the code in each of them. Then finally, we also have one function which will log all the big expenses. So we can pass in a limit, and then it will go through all the expenses and log the big ones in a certain way. And let's actually call that function here. And let's say 1,000. And so it then prints only the emoji of all the expenses that were more expensive than 1,000. All right. And so let's now fix all of this, and starting with the var keyword here. So as we learned in the last lecture, we should always use const or let instead of var. So I will select all of them by clicking or hitting Command D and change them to const, even though there is one that should not be a const, which is this one here. So when we don't need a const, then we should use let. And we will see why that is here in a minute. All right, so that was the first fix. Then this one here, the name limits isn't really meaningful, so let's call it spending limits. So again, selecting it everywhere, and then spending limits. And so this makes the code more readable and more understandable, especially if we look at it in the future. Now we have some problem in line 39. So it's the same problem as before. It should also be a let. And then line 59. Yeah, here it should also be a let. Okay, now everything works as before. Here we already changed the function name to addExpense as before. Then here we have these parameter names, which actually make sense. So these are fine, no need to change anything here. Then next up, we have this check. So what happens here? So if there's no user, then set the user to Jonas. Now, what does this actually mean? Well, essentially, this is like setting a default parameter, right? So again, if the user is not set, as we're checking here, then it should be set to Jonas. And let's confirm that that actually happens here. And so indeed here, when pizza is added without the third argument, which is user, then it is automatically set to Jonas. But again, as we learned in the last lecture, whenever possible, we should use the native language features. So in this case, the default parameters. So that's as simple as this. And if we now check it again, then yeah, it is still Jonas. Nice. Okay. Next up, let's fix this ugly nested code here. So this code looks like it was written by a complete beginner, and so we want to avoid that, right? So instead of using this nested code and this huge if-else statement with all of these blocks here, let's instead use a nice and declarative ternary operator. So let's actually call it limit, because lim again is not really a nice variable name. It's not really descriptive, right? So to do this, let's first analyze what actually happens here. So the function, of course, receives a user, and then here we check if there is actually a property with the name of user in spending limits. So for example, with the default argument here, Jonas, then of course there is spending limits.jonas. And so then in this case, the limit will be set to that value. So 1500. Okay. And otherwise, if that name does not exist, then the limit will be 0. And so therefore, then here in this check, the expense will not be added. So if the value is less than the limit, then the expense will not be added. And so therefore, we are setting the limit to 0 if the name does not exist. So if someone else, like J here, is trying to add a new expense, then the limit of J will be 0. And so therefore, he will not be able to add any expense, right? So basically here we can do just what we do here. So we can basically just do what we do here. So check if this exists, and if it does, then we return it, and otherwise we just return 0. So we can now delete this. And of course here finally we can change it to a limit. And yeah, so our code here still works the same. We still get pizza added and going to movies for Matilda, which has a value of -100. And a bit more about that in a second. Now, if we try to add a value for Matilda which is greater than 100, let's say 110, then you immediately see that it was not added. So now the last one that we have here is pizza. Okay, and the same here for J. So again, J is not in the spending limits, therefore his limit is 0, and then that means that his expense is not going to be added. Okay. Now, this one here works just fine, but we could make it even more clever if we wanted. So let me show you another way of doing the same thing. And I said in the last lecture that we shouldn't write too clever code, at least if we then cannot understand it. But the one I'm going to show you here is actually not too bad. So what we're going to do here is to use optional chaining. So optional chaining, remember, works like this, but we can even use it with bracket notations. So here we can then ask for the user property again. And so, as we learned before, if there is a property with this name, for example, Jonas here, then all of this here will be that value. But if not, then it will be undefined. So in that case, we then want to set it to 0. And for that, we can use the nullish coalescing operator, which was introduced in ES 2020 at the same time as this one here. So as optional chaining. And these are actually huge additions to the language. They're used all the time. And so it's a good idea that you get used to writing code like this. All right, so let's see. And our result should be exactly the same. And indeed it is. Great. So I think that this one here is even better. So in case that the value is indeed below the limit, then a new object is created like this and will then be pushed to this budget array. That makes sense, right? Now the value here will then be the value, but negative. So you see here that all our expenses are negative values and the incomes are positive. And since we're adding an expense, it should indeed be negative. Now here we can actually improve our code a little bit because we have description equal description and user equal user. But that's not necessary, right? Because with the enhanced object literal syntax, we don't need to repeat that. So if the property name is the same as the variable name, we can simply do this and our result will still be the same. Great. So with this, our code already looks a lot more professional than it did in the beginning, right? But anyway, let's move on here to the next one. And so, as I said in the beginning, what this function here does is to check all of the expenses and see if none of them exceeds the spending limit. So the name here is, again, not ideal. So let's actually call it check expenses. And so what this function does is it loops over all of the entries of the budget like this. And here it's simply called like L for element. So let's change that to entry. Entry. So a budget entry. That makes a bit more sense. And then here, again, we get that spending limit from the spending limits object. Now here, of course, we don't have any user passed in, but the username is simply gotten from each of the current budget entries, right? And if any of this is a bit confusing to you, then please just pause the video and analyze the code a bit better for yourself. So that's not really the point of this video. The point of this one is more to fix the code, so to make it more clean and especially more modern. So you see that this code that we have here is very similar to the one that we had before. So here in this function. So let's just copy this and put that here. And then here it is entry.user. And yeah, then we can get rid of all of this. And here we need to go back to calling it limit. And let's see what happens then. So here we have this bigger expense. So it's over the 1500 limit. And so indeed, now we get a new property here, flag set to limit, just as we have it here. There should be another one somewhere. Yeah, I think for Matilda, because she has the limit of 100, but these toys were 125. And so this one also has the limit flag. So flag set to the string of limit. So that still works nice. We can just improve this a little bit more because this code is now essentially the same as this one. So remember the dry principle. So we should not repeat ourselves. And so what I'm going to do is to refactor this code into its own function, which I'm going to call get limit. And for these simpler functions, I like to use a simple arrow function. So it's going to take a user, and here, of course, it's not the arrow yet. So it takes a user, and then it basically just returns this. Right? And so here the limit is going to be get limit for the user. And then down here, the same. And let's actually put that right here. So get limit, and remember it here, it is entry.user. Then we can get rid of this. And because now we can actually get rid of the block entirely, because now the only thing that we have in the loop is just this one declaration. So we don't need these ugly braces anymore. And the same actually here. All right, so that's a bit better. And in fact, we will keep improving this after the next lecture, when we will basically make this whole code here a little bit more functional and more declarative. But for now, this is already a lot better than what we had initially. And here actually we can do the same. Take that, put it here, and then just like this. Let's just check again if everything is correct. And indeed, it is still flagged with the limit. Okay, nice. We can get rid of this one here. Let's actually put all of the logs at the end. And now finally, we have the big expenses function, which will basically simply log to the console this string here. And so let's improve the name here a little bit and set it to log big expenses. So that's a little bit better. And here this limit now seems a little bit as if it is the spending limit of before, but it's really not. It's just like an arbitrary limit that we pass in just to see expenses that are bigger than this value. So let's just call this one here the big limit. And again, because it's a different kind of limit. So if I change it here like to 100, then this should here change the output. And so now these are all the expenses that are bigger than 100. If I put bigger than just 1, then probably all of them will appear here, right? Let's put it to 500 maybe. Yeah, then we have only these two. Okay, so what can we improve here? Well, first, let's again change the name here to entry. Then here we can transform this string here, which has this plus, into a template literal, which is a lot more modern. So here we want then this part, and then simply this string. So none of this, and just like this. Now, just a small observation. We are taking the emoji out here of the string, which is this entry.description, by getting the last 2 characters. Okay, now that's because emojis basically count as 2 characters. If I had only 1, like this, then we would get this weird sign here. All right, so it counts as 2 characters. Only then it works. Then we also have this small hack here, which is necessary because otherwise, in the end, we will have this separator here. But we will keep that here for now and fix it in the lecture after the next one. All right, then all we can fix here is to get rid of this ugly if and transform it once again into the ternary operator. So how can we do that? So we want to add something to the output conditionally, basically. So in case the entry value is less than the limit, then we want to add this, right? And otherwise, we don't want to add anything. And so that is just the empty string. Now we can get rid of this, and once again get rid of these curly braces. Give it a save, and here we are back, and now this looks a little bit better. So we say it's more declarative, so it's more readable, and you will learn actually what declarative really means in the next lecture. Okay, and I think that is actually it for this lecture. So we followed many of the guidelines of the last lecture. Now, of course, not all of them, because it's quite difficult to create an example which violates all of them. That would have to be a huge example. But I think this example is nice enough, and we will again improve it in the next lecture, or actually the one after the next lecture. So take some time and review what we did here. And again, if something is not 100% clear why it works the way it does, then just take a minute and review this code. And of course, take a minute to take another look at all the guidelines for clean and modern code that I showed you in the last lecture. And then after that, let's move together to the next one.